Welcome to History 112, Lecture 9, The Populists. American farmers at this time, although they tended to be individualistic, also exhibited tendencies to organize. In 1867, the National Grange of the Patriots of Husbandry forms. Although in the early years it's really all about social gatherings and farm education and better farming methods, but the Depression of 1873 is to cause many of its members to form marketing cooperatives on the theory of helping farmers bypass middlemen and raise their profits. They're also looking to take on railroads and warehouses that could charge whatever they want, and were generally making it tough for farmers to earn a good living during this depression. Now, in the 1870s, the Grangers do get very organized, and they succeed in controlling state legislations of many Midwestern states where they get what were known as Grange laws passed. But the return of agricultural prosperity in the 1870s, and then the Supreme Court striking down a number of these Grange laws, caused these organizations ultimately to go into decline. One of the more important Supreme Court rulings in this regard is the Wabash case, where in 1886 the Supreme Court overruled a series of laws regulating railroads, arguing that these new state laws were an unconstitutional effort to control interstate commerce. In 1887, Congress responds with the Interstate Commerce Act, which prohibited rate discrimination in short and long hauls and required railroads to publish rate schedules, and declared that all rail rates must be reasonable and just. And these were good steps forward, although they by no means were as much as the farmers had been looking for. And importantly, also, this act is only going to be loosely enforced for about the next 20 years until Teddy Roosevelt is going to ask Congress to pass stronger regulations to help deal with the railroad and some of the problems that are having. So while the Grange does ultimately fail, it does get some improvements for farmers. Increasingly, as the Granges go into decline, new farmers' alliances start to emerge in the South and the Midwest. Now, many of these are primarily concerned with local problems, but some of them have a larger vision of big reforms that would somehow replace the competitive economy with a cooperative system. And these alliances start to grow quite powerful. By 1880, the Southern Alliance, for example, had 4 million members. By 1889, a decade later, these alliances come together in a loose merger and they meet in Ocala, Florida, and issue what are called the Ocala Demands. Now, this movement goes so far as to start running people for political office in 1890, and they have some successful elections. They get 6 governors, 3 senators, and 50 congressmen out of that. By 1892, they're strong enough to meet in Omaha, Nebraska, and nominate James Weaver as a candidate for the People's Party for President of the United States. Now, Weaver is going to run and take 8.5% of the popular vote. And while nearly 1,500 populist candidates are going to win seats in state legislatures. So, in a very short period of time, this party comes out of nowhere and really begins to be quite effective at advocating for farmers' interests. Now, the interests those farmers were looking for were not necessarily going to be supported by all. They're looking to get rid of national banks and establish sub-treasuries and depositories that will loan money directly to people at low rates of interest rather than the existing system where the national banks would then loan it to more local banks who would then loan it to them. They're looking to cut the middlemen out. They're also looking to increase currency in circulation by printing greenbacks and an unlimited coinage of silver. And what they're trying to do with that is they're trying to create inflation. They're trying to change the value of money because if they can drive inflation up, that means that they're going to be receiving more income on their farm goods compared to their loans, which is where farmers tend to be mostly in trouble. So they're really looking at targeting banks and financial institutions. They're also trying to deal with some stock market reform. They want to get rid of the trade in agricultural futures. They also want to go after the railroads, and they also want to prohibit foreign ownership of land and assets. One of the big things that they advocate is what they call equal rights. They do not want legislation that sponsors one industry at the expense of another. They want graduate income tax, lower tariffs. They also want to cut down the size of government, and they want the direct election of senators. increasingly as this party continues to become known as either the Greenback Labor Party or the Populist Party. And the Populists are really trying to create a broad based political coalition, but their appeal is mainly to farmers because their main drive is remote inflation of farm prices and cooperative marketing. And ultimately, that's going to go against the interests of some other groups, and they're going to generally fail to attract organized labor because A, they tended to find the anti immigration stance the populists had as threatening, and also, currency inflation was going to threaten the standard of living due to rising prices and low wages. So that was going to be a problem and directly go against the interests of industrial workers. Now, we should understand that a lot of populists and their key supporters are what we would call culturally marginal. They're out of the mainstream of American life, and these are people who feel disenchanted and disenfranchised with America and are coming together in a mass movement looking for their interests and looking for their own seat at the table. Now, the populists are a political force to be reckoned with, but part of what's going on has to do with some economic issues. So we need a slight detour for a second. We have to understand there is a depression in 1893, and it's the worst depression in American history up to that point, and it results from the collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which triggered a general stock market collapse and bank failures across the board. And the panic really had to do with how interdependent the American economy was, that a failure in one area triggered massive failures in others, and prosperity is not going to return until 1901. Now, populists are going to play a big role in what happens and also in some of the causes of this depression. We should understand that populists, when the depression hits, start advocating for a lot. An individual named Coxey is going to raise what he calls Coxey's Army, and he is going to try to convince Congress to build public highways and issue local bonds to really restart the economy, and he leads a march on Washington where he is ultimately arrested. There are labor strikes that come out of these things. So there's a lot of chaos that emerges in this time period with a lot of people actively seeking something to be done to make things better. Now, to understand what happens with the populist movement, we have to remember that while culturally marginal, they are a force to be reckoned with. And we have to back up a couple of years to look at one of the causes of the Depression of 1893 to understand what's going to ultimately happen with this party. Now, one of the token responses to the populists that had been brought in by the government was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, wherein Congress would buy 4.5 million ounces of silver each month at market prices. This would help change currency values and was thought to help sponsor some changes in farm prices, which was one of the things the populists wanted. They had gained enough support to be a force, so Congress was trying to give them a little bit and see if it would maybe calm things. Now, what Congress was going to do was they're going to issue treasury notes redeemable in gold to pay for all of this, and that ultimately creates the inflation that the populists were looking for. Now, it's also going to lower gold reserves, and it's going to cause a run on government gold, and going to weaken significantly all of these banks right before the shock of the railroad collapse. Now, Cleveland is ultimately going to blame Sherman for the Depression and repeal the act almost immediately in 1893. Ultimately, J.P. Morgan, who is a major financier, has to step in and bail the government out, and that allows the situation to stabilize, although prosperity is not going to return until 1901. This action permanently splits the Democratic Party, and farmers are going to see this as Morgan buying the government and only further add fuel to their populist fire. Now, the issue of silver is going to be propelled to the forefront of American politics by the Depression of 1893. Now, up until that had been a kind of a populist thing, but now the two major political parties need to weigh in on it because of how the economy is unfolded. Now, the Republicans are going to nominate William McKinley of Ohio as their presidential candidate this time, and he is going to adopt a conservative platform that opposes free silver unless there's an agreement with other major trading nations. And that has to do with keeping our currency value relative to other ones to not change our international trade situation. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, look like they're ready to go ahead and do the same until William Jennings Bryan gives a big speech in the Democratic Convention, which changed a lot of minds, called the Cross of Gold, and Bryan ultimately becomes nominated as the Democratic candidate, and he represents the interests of rural Protestant middle class Americans. Now, importantly, Williams Jennings Bryan is going to now be the key Democratic candidate, and he is going to go ahead and push the free silver issue. Now, the Democratic nomination and the adoption of this platform is going to cause a huge dilemma for populists because their key issue, silver, had just been stolen by one of the big parties. And if they are going to be successful in advocating their own interests, they have to retain an identity. And what's happening is they're being fused with a bigger party. Now, what's going to happen is the populists are going to nominate Williams Jennings Bryan and a man named Tom Watson as their candidates for president and vice president. And while the Democrats are going to nominate Bryan again and a different vice presidential candidate. And what that means is the populists and the Democrats are running the same person on the ticket. And that really ultimately fuses the two parties. And this really marks the end of the populist party. They lose their identity as they're basically being vacuumed up by the Democrats. Now, in 1896, the business and financial communities are going to rally behind McKinley, fearing the consequence of a Democratic victory and the change in currency values. And McKinley was going to conduct what he called his front porch campaign from his home in Ohio. And at this point in time, as a candidate for president, you did not go and travel and campaign in the way that candidates do. You had people go and do it for you. It was considered impolite to go out and advocate for yourself. Now, McKinley, his approach was that he would stand on his front porch in the morning, and if any crowd should gather, reporters should come by, he would by all means be happy to give a speech or to answer questions and campaign from his front porch. So, in other words, if you came to McKinley, he would address you. But Bryan is going to be the first presidential candidate to go around and to create a national campaign and visit all sections of the country and campaign for himself. And that really helps change modern politics. Bryan is the origin of the way we do it now. Now, the problem for Bryan is the more people that meet him, the more people dislike him, and a lot of his speeches and politics tended to antagonize a lot of different voting groups. And where he really fell down was a lot of people, when they heard him give speeches about Protestant morality and so on, these immigrants who are largely from Catholic countries in a lot of the urban settings this time, have a real problem with him. And we have to understand, in the 19th century, there is a real rivalry and real animosity between these immigrant groups and the Protestant establishment. So this is going to ultimately undermine Bryan. Now, McKinley is going to receive 271 electoral votes to Bryan's 176. Bryan's going to only win areas of the South and West where miners or economically struggling farmers were. The Democratic program at this point was not broad-based enough to win a national campaign. Now, the major result of this election was the Populist Party collapses. Now, the movement is going to represent widespread protest against the excess of industrialism, and its failure means that most Americans accepted industrial consolidation and the monopolies that were emerging. The failure of the populists, though, breaks the equilibrium between the two political parties, with the Republicans emerging as the far more dominant. Because remember, during this entire time period, up until this point, you're looking at voting margins about 1.5%. This breaks that. Now, farmers are going to abandon efforts at reform and become part of the interest group system that's going to arise in the early 20th century. So the farmers are going to get out of politics in the direct way and find a new route into it. And as the politics is reinvented in the 20th century, they're going to play a very key role, albeit as an interest group. Now, McKinley's presidency is ultimately going to put the silver issue to bed for a while. He presides over a period of relative domestic calm, and stability is starting to return as we're moving towards economic prosperity by about 1901 again. He's looking at tariffs, and he's going to go ahead and put high import duties on foreign goods, which is a very Republican thing to do at this stage. Now, his administration will be very cautious with silver, and the Republicans are going to enact the Currency or Gold Standard Act of 1900 that confirms the nation's commitment to gold and not silver as the primary way of backing our money. And ultimately, what pushes silver out of the public mind is there's more and more debates over foreign affairs that have come to dominate the American attention, and we'll talk about those in subsequent lectures. While free silver failed, it ultimately raised some important questions about the nature of American economy, and what was really central was the money supply had not kept pace with economic progress. There was just not enough money to circulate around, and that was causing real hardships for farmers in particular. And while the farmers did and the populists did talk about how there would be financial disasters if nothing was done and if silver wasn't brought together, well, there were a lot of major gold strikes this time period that really helped stave that off for a while. And importantly, the failure of free silver is going to keep the country on the gold standard until the Great Depression of the 1930s. So, what's the big idea here? Well, farmers are going to face major hardships, and out of those hardships, questions about whose interests the economy should be run in really start to emerge. They start to talk about who should be dominant, who should be left included, who should be left out, and importantly, it all coalesces around the idea of using silver as money. And that would allow the amount of money in circulation to go up, that would drive inflation, that would help farm prices, but it would ultimately hurt others. While the idea of silver fails, in the end, what the most important consequence is, the party equilibrium between the Democrats and the Republicans is finally broken, and things are really going to start rapidly changing right around the year 1900. See you in the next lecture.